Hello and welcome to Great Britain in Focus. I'm James McCullough.
And I'm Pascal Mary Rakovich. Today we have a beautiful vocation story given by Bishop Athanasius Schneider, an auxiliary bishop from Kazakhstan.
Bishop Schneider grew up in the former Soviet Union in a persecuted and clandestine church. But despite this, he speaks of the graces he received that enabled him to follow his vocation to priesthood.
So what were the greatest influences in the discovery of his vocation? And what does he consider to be most important for sustaining a priestly vocation?
Let's now hear his story.
I'm very grateful to God that I was born in a true Catholic family. I consider this the greatest gift which God can give to someone, to grow up in a Catholic family, and I received, so as to say, the Catholic faith with mother's milk. This is an unspeakable grace, which I consider greater than even the priesthood or the episcopate. So we see how important it is, a good Catholic family. For generations, it was already preparing the soil, the natural soil from which they are now growing the vocations. And so in the second grace, I consider that I grew up in the persecuted church, in the communist time, in Soviet Union. And to live in a persecuted church or in the clandestine church, you receive special graces. So I experienced this, which mark you your entire life in the future. And this gave me the foundations of my Christian life, the experience in this persecuted church in the Soviet Union. And then the experience of the house church, or we call the domestic church. This is the family, the Catholic family, as the Second Vatican Council called the family as a domestic church. I had the grace and the privilege to have good Catholic parents. Their name is Joseph and Mary. My mother always said to my father, we have to seek first God in our life, and the rest will be given to us. And so I experienced in my life, we had always the blessing of God. We were not rich. Of course, in Soviet Union, all the people had to live very modest. But God always provided us. My parents were very good, took very good care of us and gave us all which we needed. But they also educated us to a modest life and to prayer and to be merciful. I remember these counsels and teachings of my parents both were constantly in our family. In the absence of the priests, even for years, during years, we had no priests. But we kept the Catholic faith in the family. My mother was my catechist, and she taught us, my siblings and me, very good catechism. And then on Sundays, where there were no priests, we gathered the parents, we children, and we sanctified the day of the Lord with prayers, even in the absence of a priest. We made spiritual Holy Communion. And this gave us strength, really. And then I had a grace, is another factor in my life and in my way of the vocation. I consider to have met and to have had a holy priests. First, Blessed Alexei Zaritsky, a martyr priest. He was martyred and died in Kazakhstan close to the city Karaganda. And my mother once saved him from the persecution of the police and has hidden him. And he several times came to our family. And lastly, the last time, it was before he was ultimately brought again to the prison, to the Gulag. He blessed me. I was a little child of 1 year old. And I consider this blessing of him, of this martyr priest, also the fundamentals, the foundation of my vocation. And his prayers for us. And then later, when we moved from Central Asia to Estonia, I was 9 years old, 10 years, and we lived there 4 years. And we had the privilege to have a church in Estonia, more or less 70 miles from our town, with a beautiful old church. And there was also a very holy priest who was our pastor, Father Jānis Pavlovskis, from Latvia, born. He was a Capuchin priest. And he gave me the first Holy Communion, and I made my first Holy Confession with this priest when I was more or less 9 or 10 years old. And this priest, who also spent a lot of years, many years in the camp of concentration before, he left upon my soul as a child a deep impression, unforgettable, simply with his irradiance of holiness. He did not speak much, but all his behavior, the manner he celebrated Mass, the manner he spoke, the manner he preached, was so profound and simple and profound and holy that it made to me a deep impression, this holy priest. And unfortunately, in the Soviet Union, as children, we could not serve Mass. It was not allowed. Only adult men could serve Mass. And so I had not the possibility to be altar boy with this holy priest. But when we came to Germany, I was 12 and a half years old, I started to serve Mass. And then, after the first time when I served Mass, immediately I had, in some way, before my spiritual eyes, the face of this holy priest, my parish priest in Estonia, Father Jānis Pavlovskis. And from this moment, I felt in my soul that I have to become a priest. And since then, I had never doubts in this, my vocation, thanks be to God. And so, but a vocation has to be prepared in a natural ground. These are the families, the Catholic family, the domestic church, and also to have good priests as examples who attract graces and transmit to the children and the youth. And through these, God touches the souls of young boys and men and calls them to the priesthood, to the vocation. So this I consider the second factor, the priests, good examples of priests on the way of vocation. And then also indispensable for a vocation is the constant prayer of the parents for their son who is on the way to priesthood. When I became priest and celebrated my first Holy Mass, after my first Holy Mass in the town where my parents lived in Germany, then my father said to my mother, we prayed a lot for our son until he became priest, but now we had to double our prayers for him, that he may be faithful and remain faithful as a priest. And so they did. And thanks be to God, my mother is still alive. And sometimes when I phone to her, and since always after my ordination as priest, one of the last words when the phone call from her to me was always, "You remain faithful to Jesus." So this is our word and the command of a mother. Beautiful. I could not have more beautiful words to hear from a mother, even as a bishop. You remain faithful to Jesus. And this is the most important in our life, of every one of us, but especially for the priests and those who have holy vocation, to remain faithful to Jesus until death. It means to remain faithful to the integrity of the Catholic doctrine, of the reverence of the true tradition of the Holy Liturgy, of the Mass, of a holy life of a priest, and to be not contaminated by the fashion of the world, of the intellectual fashions of the world. And this I consider the most important in the life of us and in the life of a priest.
Fiorella De Maria is a Catholic writer specialising in historical fiction. She speaks about what distinguishes her Catholic writing from its secular equivalent.
She challenges the current trend of thinking that mankind moves forward in history towards a state of progressive enlightenment, believing ourselves to be always in a better position than in the past.
She also answers the important question of what is the difference between a Catholic imagination and a secular imagination in understanding our past and present. So let's hear some of her insights.
So, Fiorella, I believe you're a writer.
I am, yes. I've been a writer.
What do you write?
I write historical fiction and also, more recently, crime fiction.
What sort of historical fiction? What periods?
I vary quite a lot. I rather homed in on the mid-20th century because my crime fiction is set just after the Second World War. But I've written a book about the First World War, about the early days of the Second World War, and also about the slave trade, so going right back into the 1600s. So I like to be able to go on lots of different journeys into the past. You know, it's like being a time traveller.
Yeah, doesn't sound like a bundle of laughs, so...
The book about the slave trade was definitely the darkest book I've ever written.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't like to write anything like it again, but I come from slave ancestry, and Malta has a history of slavery, North African slavery, and I've always wanted to write a book about my people's experience of the slave trade. So that was always something I wanted to do, but it's very much a once in a career thing. You know, you take that journey into the past just the once, because it is very dark, it's very depressing.
Yeah. What's the initial attraction to subject matter? I mean, is it a story, is it a character, is it a period of history?
It varies a lot, actually. With the slave trade, I wanted to write a book about the Mediterranean slave trade, so I started off with a period and then thought of the characters, and the more research I did, the more the setting started to come to life. And in fact, the story I ended up writing was very, very different to what I initially envisaged.
Yeah.
Because I wanted to have more humane characters than I realised I could. When I actually did the research and realised what happened, I had to make the story a lot darker.
Yeah.
So in some cases, yes, it's a period. In other cases, it's just an idea. So with one of my books, with Father William's daughter, it's all about a priest who inherits a child.
Right.
His brother is killed in a car crash, and his brother is a widower. and he has to look after this child. And it all stemmed from the fact that when I was a child, my parents had written a will, like all responsible parents do, and they'd named my uncle as my legal guardian, who was in fact a priest.
Oh, right.
And I remember saying, well, what would actually have happened?
Yes.
You know, would I have gone and lived in his monastery or in his parish or whatever? And so the story, in fact, it's a tragicomic story about what happens, and you know, it develops all sorts of ideas about sort of unexpected parenthood and all sorts of things like that. But that literally came from a what-if situation.
But answer me this, because historical fiction is very broad and there's wonderful scope. But what is the difference from a Catholic perspective, as a Catholic writer, entering into that world? Is there a difference?
I think there is, because I'd like to hope that a Catholic writer would approach the past with a little more humility than
Is that your
modern
strongest
writers do.
point, humility, would you say?
Humility, yes, I'm very humble. Yes, I've written books about my humility. But seriously, I think, you know, because we have this traditions and our sense of our place in history, I would like to think that helps us to perhaps be a little bit more humble about where we stand in the great story of humanity. You know, so perhaps when we look back into the past, we don't do so with the idea of, gosh, we're so progressive, we're so modern, and weren't they stupid? You know, hopefully we would have a slightly more broad-minded attitude.
It's really kind of interesting because you use the word, I mean, the complaint about Catholicism is not progressive enough, and yet we are very much a historical religion, right?
We are, exactly.
So does that play out in the fiction, that it's more progressive in a sense, being a Catholic historical fiction novelist? I'd
say it's more open-minded. It's it's entirely connected up with perspective, and perspective is so important when you're writing about the past. There's that old line from The Go-Between, the past is a foreign country, and I quote it extensively in my book, We'll Never Tell Them. The narrator keeps coming back to that line, and you have a choice as a writer of historical fiction in terms of how you travel to that foreign country. Are you going to be the annoying tourist who expects all the food that you're used to and doesn't want to interact with the locals? Or are you going to be someone who goes on an adventure and really seeks to get to know that country? Yeah. And that is, I hope, what a Catholic writer can do.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. What's the role then of the Catholic novelist in rebuilding culture?
It's to recast the narrative.
Right.
Yeah. You recast narrative.
So you don't propagandize,
no.
you don't preach.
Nope.
That's for the pulpit.
Absolutely. If you want to be a lecturer, be a lecturer.
Right.
Or if you want to write a textbook, write a textbook.
Right.
So it's recasting the narrative, and that's the wonderful thing about historical fiction, because so much of the way history is treated and mistreated it's all about making us feel good about ourselves.
What do you mean?
Well, it's about saying, look, this is where we are here. Aren't we progressive? We're so woke. We're so enlightened. Aren't we wonderful? And so therefore, how did we get here? Well, we got here because the past was awful and history was terrible, and there was this wonderful journey to enlightenment. In fact, I think the Age of Enlightenment is very responsible for this idea of this constant move towards positive change. And what the Catholic writer should be doing is saying, just a moment, are you sure about that? Are you sure we really are more moral, we have better values than we had in the past? And to actually go back into the past and try to understand a little bit better how people really did live their lives, but to do it respectfully. Okay, but can a historical fiction writer, 21st century, young woman like yourself, born shortly before this century, can you really write with the insight for somebody in the Second World War, First World War, 17th century? It's a valid question, and I think, in all honesty, you can never completely get rid of those lenses that you know, of the focus of the modern world, because we grew up in this time. Yes. And in the end, however much research you do, you can't really say what it was like living in 1850s London. or in the trenches in the First World War, there's always going to be some gap,
That's right.
if you like, of imagination. But I do think if you really immerse yourself in the period, which is what I do when I'm writing a book.
Right.
So, for example, when I wrote about the First World War, I listened to First World War music, I read newspapers from the time, newspaper articles from the time.
Is it true that you dressed for that period completely in First World War outfits?
I didn't, but I learned a lot about the fashions of the times.
Right.
I could tell you exactly what a woman was wearing in 1940.
Really?
Yeah, it's important.
Really? You really go into that much?
I mean, that much detail. But also, this is where understanding the people comes into it. One of the reasons why a certain scriptwriter, I shall not mention, got into trouble with his period drama was that he was using expressions
Yes.
that had only just been coined in
Yes.
1920.
Fatal mistake.
Yeah, when someone in his 50s in a rural area would never have heard of that expression.
Yes.
So it's also a question of understanding the people you're writing about. So, for example, in my First World War book, there's an older doctor who's a bit conservative. So I wasn't going to dress him up in the style of 1930 when he would in fact probably have been dressing more like the style of 1918.
Yes.
It's things like that make
Yes.
a difference. But it's mostly just trying to strip away your own expectations.
But is there a sense, Fiorella, where the idea that, which I'm not absolutely sold on, that all novels are autobiographical? But is there also an idea that all novels are really about now?
If you look at any book written about the past, whenever it was, if you look at Ivanhoe, it tells you a lot more about the period in which it was written than about the period it was trying to write
Victorian
about.
England,
Yeah, fair enough. And I think that is unavoidable, and we have to sort of accept that as part of the package when you're writing historical fiction. It is historical fiction, it's not a historical document from the period. But I do think that if you go humbly on that journey, you can get as close as it's possible to get to that time. You have to really care about the characters. You have to respect them. The biggest problem, I think, with so many writers of historical fiction now is they do patronise the past. They go by the assumption, before they've even started their research, that the people they're writing about were idiots. They're already looking down on them.
Yeah.
Or like they were a bit like children who hadn't developed enough yet. If you go into the past and really embrace it and say, these were my brothers from another time.
Yeah.
And you can start to try to reconstruct the sort of values they would have held.
Okay, I get that. But is there a sense where you and I are living now?
Yeah.
This historical moment, this epoch, is ours.
Yes.
And is there a case that our fiction or creative energy should be exploring, interrogating this moment in time, rather than looking back to other times, exploring other crises, other dilemmas, other contradictions that people dealt with 100 years ago, 200 years ago?
Well, I don't think there's any reason why you can't do so by going back into the past, because, as I've already suggested, in order to understand the world we currently live in, we have to understand how we got here. Well, we have to have an honest view of how we got here. One of the problems I always feel with the way history is taught in British schools is that children are taught, say, the Second World War or the First World War. They're not taught about the unification of Germany or Italy or any of the big upheavals in Europe in the 19th century that created that world. You can't understand it unless you understand what came before. And I do think that a very important way of perhaps challenging the way we see ourselves is to understand how we got here and understand how people really did live in the past, not the strange caricature we've created.
So, Fiorella, what you're talking to me about is some kind of understanding of Catholic salvation history.
Yeah.
That history is a stream, and that you are plugging into a stream which is not a series of isolated events, but something which is continuous, has a beginning, which was the Garden of Eden, has a middle, which is Golgotha, and has an end, which is the second coming.
That's exactly what I mean. Exactly. It's that tapping into, as you say, the stream, rather than seeing history as if it were, a series of isolated events that are completely separate from one another and that do not draw on one another. So it's mostly really a question of imagination. I don't think it's even difficult. It's a question of imagination and friendship with the past, a sense of fellowship with the past, if you like.
I think that's really interesting. Talk to me a bit about the Catholic imagination. What's the difference between the Catholic imagination and, say, the secular imagination which passes for so much literature today?
Well, I think that the secular imagination is quite narcissistic. If you imagine someone looking in a mirror as opposed to looking out of a window, maybe that's the image I would use.
Really?
Yes. That the Catholic imagination is about looking out, not looking in so much.
So are you rejecting the whole sort of Freudian construct?
Well, the Freudian construct has been mostly rejected, let's face it, apart from in my English faculty, as far as I can work out. It's the only place where they taught Freud seriously.
But also sort of modernism in literature, it's all about stream of consciousness, it's all about internal debates, it's all, you're saying that is just narcissism?
I'm not saying there's no room at all for any kind of internal conversation, because so much of our spirituality involves an internal conversation, at least a private conversation. It's also connected up with our understanding that we are more than the sum of our parts. We are more than our minds and our bodies. We have a soul. We're on a journey. It's a very different way, really, of seeing human life and the human journey, and it's become radical. This is the way most people saw the world once, but it's become less usual, and I think certainly contemporary fiction is very aggressively secular, but there are trends that are going the other way. There are also books that I think are maybe trying to capture some sense of the spiritual journey or the spiritual life, but it's very much at the moment on the fringes. But it just comes back in the end to the imagination, to that sense of fellowship with the past. That the past is a foreign country, but the people of the past are not foreigners.
Okay, so is the past a foreign country?
Yes. The world changes, and people do things differently.
But human nature doesn't change.
But human nature doesn't change. That's what I mean. That you have, in the past, the traditions may have been different, the way people saw the world might have been different, the social mores may have been different, but human nature does not really change fundamentally.
So taking the analogy of the stream flowing through history, are we saying the stream is human nature, it never changes, it just keeps flowing through, but the pastures either side of that stream are different?
Yeah, you should write a novel.
With you, maybe?
Yes.
Now, we're in a wood. Do you know who was in a wood? Who got lost in a wood?
Dante.
Correct.
Nel mezzo di cammin di nostra vita mi ritrovai nella selva oscura.
Which means?
In the middle of the journey of my life, I found myself in a wood where the way was lost.
But I think tonight, we haven't lost our way, have we? Because the way is, as the good book says, the way, the truth and the life.
Absolutely.
And that's true for Catholic novelists.
Absolutely.
Even true for you.
I would hope so.
Let's walk.
Thank you for joining us. Full versions of these interviews will be made available on our social media channels.
And don't forget, if you'd like to support the work of EWTN Great Britain, do visit our website ewtn.co.uk and click on the donate button.
So until next time, goodbye and God bless.